Greetings. We left off last time at database migrations completing its run, but it needs some polishing to monitor its job status. We need to output every stage of the process, when the update script starts, when each update script ends, what queries it run, and when the final process completes. These details need to be displayed on a web page and to a log file, neither of which are possible in the current state because it would require the migrations to actually be aware of the view layer. If I try to display HTML content here, or even a view model towards the controller, one of you is going to come through the door and punch me even before the upload to YouTube is finished. The effect we're after is for the process, imagine this is our DDL query, to run, and even if we close the browser, we still have logs of what is happening. Here we see the script continues to do its work and outputs into the log as it goes. If it finishes, then that's fine, the logs are complete, we can expect them whenever we want. Or if we go back to the web page, we can see the final report with a complete message. This is not anything overly complicated or beyond the regular web page. This is needed both because the migrations can take so long that the browser may give up on a connection and close it, and we still need to see where the process is, or just for debugging. If all we do is output to the browser after migrations are complete and we don't save the data somewhere, how are we going to inspect the correctness of the SQL statements if there is any problems with the database schema? But if nothing else, it gives me some reason to talk about Zend EventManager. Documentation is very good on this. You can read it and look at the examples. They work wonderfully. They're all written very nicely. But the recommended way of getting started doesn't exactly fit our scenario. They propose to use EventManager aware interface, which forces you to have set EventManager and get EventManager functions, which are fine anywhere else, but in my migrations part, I don't want people to randomly insert their own weird event managers, and I don't want them to arbitrarily get it and modify it and mess with my schema creation process. Alternatively, we could look at least in the aggregates by putting in the event manager into the migrations as opposed to migrations have control of the event manager. Still doesn't quite fit it, so we're going to go a simple route and we'll just replicate a tiny piece of the event manager interface in our migrations object by simply saying public function attach, which will take in event name and callable. This will be listener. By now we've all heard the scary stories of what bad things can happen if we put new object instantiations in a constructor. However, this is not the case where those scary stories apply. There is no use case at all where injecting any other event manager other than what we instantiate is going to be any good. Even for unit testing, usually even if we don't do swapping of objects at runtime, we still put them in a constructor through a factory so that when we unit test them, we push in a stub so it's easier to do assertions or mocks or configuration bootstraps. All we care here is that whatever callable we put into attach gets executed. How this is done, whether we use Event Manager at all, is completely irrelevant. In fact, since we mentioned unit testing, this is something we can actually do this time because this is not something that will go across systems. This is application logic again. We can safely put it in the test space. Tests are under here, under ZFT, migrations test. I should use a nicer wizard for that. PhpUnit test. Fully qualified name is the migrations. I wonder how much I will say migrations per minute now. test class is migrations test, but the namespace is ZFT test migrations. Okay, yes, please do add. We will be writing and testing code above our database logic, so we don't actually want to execute our migration script by accident and mess the databases up. So instead, we are going to make a stub migrations plus migrations stub, which will extend migrations, much like extending migrations for platform-specific version. Except this time, when we override our run scripts, we just leave them empty. So now, even if our minimum version is overridden to something like 2, just so we have something to play with, we can put that here as an empty method as well, and we can have all the database things here in the world, and none of them are going to be a problem. Except maybe set version. Set version is something that we don't want to run and mess up, and honestly this should have been protected anyway, because who knows if a different database engine has a different way of doing the set version, so keep it protected, and that way we can override it and also keep it empty without doing anything. Get version should also be updated, because who's to say that every database is going to do that the same way, and override that. This is going to be pretty important for get version, because it will allow us to manipulate whatever we want. We can say return 2, we can say return 1, we return 3, and we can test different variations of how the event manager will work depending on the version we throw at it. Is it going to really run when we have one version is different from the minimum version? And will it do something completely unnecessary if the two things are equal? This will give us an opportunity to test each of those variations. But since we decided to do this test case specific, it's probably going to be convenient to set it as public test version return this test version. And since we modified our migrations object ever slightly, we have to commit it and say opened version methods to protected level for unit tests. Now, goodness forbid anyone tries to extend this monstrosity, so we will mark it as final. No one is allowed to extend it. And by the way, in case anyone is getting upset that I'm jumping around from database to event manager and then later on back to database, not completing anything, not entirely true, because even Zend database actually relies on event manager. The event manager is very, very pervasive. Everything is using it. I was quite surprised a while ago to discover that even ZendDB uses Event Manager to run some events on pre-post queries. So that's pretty interesting. We should learn from that and follow suit. Back in migration test, we want to write a specification that the listeners have been called. Testing Event Manager after PhpUnit 5.4 is a bit more tricky because it does not allow us to mock methods that do not exist. What I used to be able to do is to create a std class, since there is no specific object that interacts with Event Manager, it can be anything, and I would just create an arbitrary method that I would pass in as a callback and verify whether it was ever called or not. Now it breaks with an error that a method that's configured doesn't exist, and it doesn't want to do anything. So we have to figure out an alternative technique. Start with an instantiation of the stub that we created for the migration. Migration equals new migrations, and of course it needs an adapter to be able to function. Adapter that it wants is based on ZendDB adapter. So adapter mock is this create mock based on adapter class. Let's see what kind of method it expects. We try to run it. It is not happy with the fact that there is no platform, so we must satisfy that requirement. Adapter mock method get platform, and it's going to return a mock for platform interface. So platform interface is this create mock platform interface class, and platform interface in turn we saw needed a get name. Let's see what kind of names is it comfortable giving out. It can work with MySQL, SQL Server, and the rest of them. SQLite is the most generic one, because even if we do need an actual database connection, SQLite being a file, we're not going to get in trouble by mocking or even including that in, as opposed to a full database engine that works on a remote socket. So this get name will return SQLite. Now the adapter mock is going to return the platform interface mock, and overall it should work slightly better. There we go. Having that established, we can say migrations, attach event name and the callable for it. The event name is just a string, but we really should not be typing it by hand. Notice how when we did MVC event over in the module, there was an object that had a list of all available events that could occur. So we should do the same thing. We will create a similar file for ourselves. We will call it migrations event. Namespace migrations class migrations event, and we need to do const, and one is going to be migrations start, and this is absolutely doesn't matter what you want to call this, migrations start, because you never actually type this out by hand. But if you do a debugger, then this is what you will see. Const update start. We want to differentiate between each of these migrate scripts starting and ending. That way, if a particular script takes a really long time to run, then we can look at the logs and see this select statement started now and it's now taking however long, so we can say, okay, yes, it does make sense that this select statement, this update script is taking so much time. So update start, finish, update dot finish, and maybe better to put migrations in front here as well. Who knows what other update things can be from other modules. And const migrations finish, migrations dot finish. Of course, we should not forget that the world is a really horrible place, so lots of bad things can happen. We must say that the migrations could possibly fail. Migrations failed, and a particular update has failed. Update failed. Migrations update failed. For it to be a properly defined event, we need to also extend event from the event manager. This will allow us to set a name, target, and parameters of what happened. Once we have this defined, we can go back to the test, and with all confidence we can say migrations event, what type of event, migration start, and what kind of function will run when that event is triggered. Here it is going to be an anonymous function, as in most places, where the listener takes in an instance of event. And for parameter is some kind of verification of whether we received the correct parameters or not. As mentioned before, current version of PhpUnit does not allow an easy way to mock non-existent anonymous functions to do direct assertions on. EventManager is notoriously more difficult to test and debug because it is not linear. Just because you may see functions appear in sequential order in code, like you have function 1 here, this one is your second function, and we have a third function down, does not mean that this is an order that they will be executed in. In fact, we're going to have function 1 first, function 3 second, and function 2 last, because this event is not going to be triggered all the way until migrations are actually executed. Thankfully, PHP is synchronous, so it's not that difficult to go back in time to see what the function has done. What we need is a variable that is accessible to both scopes. Let's say handle migrations start run is by default false. Then we import this variable into the anonymous function with use, and make sure you put ampersand in front of it so it is passed in by reference. If we do it by value, then that variable is actually copied, and when you modify it, this value will not be carried through to the PhpUnit assertions. Once that get run, this should be switched from true, and you can do an assertion. Expected is true for handle migration start run. Before we run, let's make sure this is corrected. Migration stub, not migration. We want this alternative version. We run and we get the expected failure. To pass this test back to migrations, we need to be able to trigger those events whenever necessary. So we'll go into a private EventManager property. It will take in EventManager, and we instantiate it in a constructor. This EventManager, new EventManager. Attachment of the event is done in the attach function we have designated earlier. All we do is pass the exact same parameters to the EventManager instance. Attach event name and listener. Triggering of the event will happen when we start the run. So just before we go into the loop, we can say this EventManager trigger and name of the event that we're triggering. This one is migrations event, migration start. If we run a test, it now passes, but we don't have a whole lot of useful information about what that event actually does. If we do a debug, the event is pretty empty. Let's introduce a requirement where incoming event object says what database version we're going from towards. Event object gives us an opportunity to add arbitrary parameters. So parameters are just get parameters, and it's an arbitrary associative array of key values. we want to assert that we're going from version 0 in the params from key and assert that we're going towards version 2, that's version here, in params 2. And since we're now enforcing the types of parameters that we expect, we should increase the requirement for the variable type and call it migrations event. If we run it, we are back at fail. Back to migrations. Instead of triggering just a string value, we will create a full migrations start event object. New migrations event. This migration start event is going to get us set name, the exact same name that we used earlier. Notice how in the trigger it actually does this. It creates an instance of the event object or clones it, sets the name, sets a target, sets the parameters. We have to do that manually now. Migration start event, set target, this one. And for parameters that we want, which is the from and to, we can establish migrations start params, and we know that we're going towards to self minimum schema version, and what we're going from is the current version. Migrations start param from current version. Instead of triggering this event string, we're now triggering a full event object. And not to forget to attach the migrations param to that migrations event. Set params, migration start params, and trigger it. Migration start event. We still have a failure, but different kind. It's just that our version numbers don't match. That's because it's not 100% test friendly. Our minimum version for self is pointing to this object directly. So that's not going to coincide with the minimum version in the test. So we'll make it slightly more test friendly by, instead of making it a direct reference to self, we will extract it into a protected method. So protected function get target version. It will return self minimum schema version. This get target version. And now when we go to the test, we can override it. Get target version, return version 2. So now we are directly in control of what version we're going towards and from. We run that and we get a test pass. And that covers how Zend Event Manager is used and how we test it. Now I just have to do the rest of the migration events, and I can do that off screen because there is a whole lot of them.